Hello, it's time for Japan Outpost. I'm Yuka House. Are you interested in Japanese castles? Today, I'm talking to Dr. Oleg Benush at York University, who has been doing research on Japanese castles. So please join me. May I ask why you got interested or how you got interested in the Japan and Chinese culture to start with then?
So I grew up in Alaska, which is actually quite close to Japan in a lot of ways. And so I studied a little bit of Japanese at university, and then I moved to Japan, and I ended up living in Japan for about 6 years. I just enjoyed it a lot.
How you said moved to Japan, but were you working there or?
Well, no, first I went to a language school for about 18 months, so I just studied Japanese language. And then I did my master's in Japan, and then I did PhD research in Japan as well.
Oh my gosh, really?
So, yeah, and just, I don't know, really enjoyed it there and was very interested in the culture.
Oh, what was your subject in PhD thesis then?
So that was on Bushido, working
Bushido.
at that.
That was
yeah.
in Bushido.
Yeah, so I began, I guess through my undergraduate, which was in philosophy, and I worked a lot on Chinese philosophy. And so then I had an interest in kind of Chinese and then also Japanese kind of intellectual history, ideas, thought, and culture. And that got me interested in kind of samurai thought.
You moved to the UK, you started this research then?
Yeah, so I started this work on this about 4 years ago, I guess. And there are a lot of things which it's quite fascinating and useful being in the UK, because in the period I'm looking at, the UK was arguably the biggest kind of Western influence on Japan, and there was a lot of interaction between the UK and Japan. So I think now, especially since 1945, there's a lot more emphasis on Japan-US relations. But I think if we look at the 19th century especially, but even the early 20th century, Japanese-British relations, I think, were more important. So for Japan, for example, the Anglo-Japanese alliance, which started in the very first years of the 20th century, was kind of Japan's most important alliance, and was very important for the UK during the First World War especially. Because a part of this project is, in addition to looking at the historic angle and looking at old materials from late 19th, early 20th century, it's also, I'm very interested in how the history is displayed today and how people view these things today. So by going to the castle, I'm very interested in how the museums there treat the history. How do they talk about, do they just focus on, say, the Warring States period, just the Sengoku Jidai, or do they also talk about the modern period? And so how that history is treated today is something I'm very interested in.
I see. So concrete castles, So what did you find out about them then? Why are there so many concrete castles in Japan?
The question of why concrete is a very good question. I think a big part of that is simply after the war, when people were rebuilding, many cities had just been burned in bombings, and there had been a lot of destruction. And so people wanted to build things that were solid. And so people didn't really want to build out of wood, was one issue. Wood was also quite dangerous. These buildings had to last. And so people built out of concrete. And so the castles looked the same often from the outside. They were reconstructions, but on the inside they were very much modern buildings. And so I think that is a big part of using concrete, is just looking for something solid that will last.
And then also cheap and quick? Is that true?
Well, at the time, I think it was actually quite expensive to build out of concrete, but I think it was worth it. It was quite symbolic. And one place people could see this was in Osaka, because Osaka Castle, the big keep in Osaka, was built in 1931, and it was built out of concrete. And so even though it was bombed in the war, it survived. And whereas a lot of the wooden castles like Nagoya or Hiroshima, they burned, they were destroyed. And so people could look at the concrete castle at Osaka and see that it would last for forever. And so I think there's a big change that happens in the late 1980s. And from the late 1980s, we don't really get any more concrete castles in Japan. It's very unusual. And I think people are, from the late 1980s onward, are looking for kind of authentic castles. And so now the things that are being reconstructed are being built out of wood, using traditional methods. They're very expensive, and they have had to overcome certain problems because, again, wood can burn. It's not necessarily that safe in an earthquake. So they often have to reinforce them with steel and other things in order to make them legal, because they still have to be all right for building codes so that people can go inside them even if there's an earthquake.
After Meiji Restoration era, around 1870, did you find any new trend in the usage of castles?
Yeah, so I think the biggest shift happens with major castles. For example, Nagoya, even Edo Castle, which is now kind of Tokyo Castle or the Imperial Palace. And the biggest shift is the military coming in and taking over the castle sites. Because now you have the feudal lords, the daimyo, who are now out of the castles, and you have these big empty spaces in the center of cities. And you are also creating a new imperial army. And the army goes into the castles, and they tear down old buildings, and they build new barracks, new administrative buildings, they build firing ranges, parade grounds. And so the center of most major cities in Japan is actually a big military base. Osaka, for example, has the largest arms factory in Asia inside the castle. So many Japanese cities have very large military bases at the center. They don't have any parks. Now, if you go to Japanese castles today, they are often castle parks. Most of the castle parks are products of the late 1940s and 1950s. So before 1945, these are restricted spaces surrounded by a moat and walls and the military inside of them. And so what happens, especially in the early 20th century, is if there are protests or riots or things and the police can't control them, then the military can go out and essentially restore order. And we see this in a lot of places, especially in 1919. There's the rice riots throughout Japan, and hundreds of thousands of people are in the streets, and the military goes out and puts down the riots. They come out of the castles. And so castles become very closely identified with the military in the 1920s, 1930s, all the way until 1945. And then after 1945, the US occupation takes the Japanese military out, and then the Americans are in the castles until the 1950s.
But still military then.
So they're still militarized. And so it's only after the Americans leave, really, that the local authorities get the castles. And then the castles are turned into museums, universities, schools, kind of educational things, parks. Yeah, and so then castles start taking the shape that they have today.
I see. That's very interesting. Well, thank you very much for today.
No, thank you.